Well, developing tonight, new questions about whether the president is trying to force a constitutional crisis for political gain. The question started yesterday when the president went to the Rose Garden to threaten that he was going to, quote, do something about immigration reform because Congress would not. Then today, reports surfaced that the White House was considering more executive actions right after the Supreme Court upheld First Amendment religious rights of some business owners who were reluctant to pay for medications that would kill a fertilized egg. Press Secretary Josh Earnest effectively came out and said, well, the court is wrong because the president says it's so.
We disagree, and the constitutional lawyer in the Oval Office disagrees with that conclusion from the Supreme Court.
But that is not how this democracy works exactly. The executive branch doesn't get to say, well, we're going to go it alone because the legislature and the courts are incompetent. In fact, it was less than a week ago that a unanimous Supreme Court sent the White House a very clear message that the president went too far when he personally declared Congress out of session so he could make some recess appointments that were very controversial. So why is he back at it now? And what would the fallout be? Joining me now for all of these angles, Jonathan Turley, who is a liberal constitutional scholar who's testified before Congress on this administration's threat to the constitutional system, a professor at George Washington University Law School. And Britt Hume is our Fox News senior political analyst. We begin with Professor Turley. Professor Turley, I read what you say, and you talk about how we are now on the brink of a constitutional crisis here. This president is pushing us to the tipping point.
Well, you know, Megyn, in fairness to the White House, this process or this trend didn't start with President Obama, but it certainly has accelerated with him. And he has taken this to a new level in terms of rhetoric. You know, he has now sort of boldly embraced the concept of going it alone and to some extent defying what has just happened. You know, the ink is barely dry on the Canning decision, where a unanimous court, left and right, found that he had violated the separation of powers. I testified on those appointments when they were made, and I thought that they were, and I said that they were flagrantly unconstitutional. They were not a close question. And so this obviously has more of a political value than it does a legal one. But the costs to the government are very, very high. Most presidents have avoided court tests. They've avoided these fights in deference to the presidents that would follow them. This administration has really shown very little restraint in litigating these issues and losing.
How does he compare to other presidents? Because every president, not every, a lot of them get a little drunk on their own power and want to make their own presidency a very robust one.
Well, unfortunately, I think we're seeing something of a perfect storm with the politics aligning with the motivation you just described. You're absolutely right, Megyn. There's something that happens in that office that tends to detach presidents from that original oath to uphold the Constitution and to comply with these types of rules, particularly separation of powers. But now you have this rather toxic political environment where this type of confrontation is popular. But, you know, it's simply not the case that you can blame gridlock and say, you know, because nothing's getting done, I'm going to force it to be done on my terms. That's not how it's done. You know, there's no license in our system to go it alone. You have to convince Congress. And if you can't, then things don't get done. But this is a system of three branches. But what we're seeing, Megyn, and this is what worries me, is this rise of what I've called an uber presidency, this presidency that can govern alone. That is exactly what the framers were afraid of. They wanted to avoid the concentration of power, not to protect the interests of the branches, but to protect individuals, to protect civil liberty from what happens when power is concentrated.
Right, because there's supposed to be checks and balances, even on the commander-in-chief, as powerful as he is, especially on him. Jonathan Turley, great of you to be here. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Megyn.